August 13th, 2018. Continuing on the formal public meeting process, next up is delegate number 5, Dan Curry. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. I've just got a one-pager I'd like to pass out. So thank you. Dan Curry, MHBC Planning. I'm here on behalf of several of our clients, and we've submitted a variety of different letters, I think maybe half a dozen. But I'll keep my comments relatively brief and really around three categories. And the first is, I mean, as others have said before, there's a lot of good things in this zoning bylaw, and that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle a little bit, the nature of the process. I'm here on behalf of, I don't know, a dozen different clients. I have 10 minutes. I've necessarily got to cut to the things that I want changed as opposed to the, you know, the good things. And it came up earlier in the afternoon session. There are a number of good points. It's, as others have said too, also recognize that what a substantial undertaking it is to undertake this. I mean, it's been led by Joel, the rest of his team, and I as well pass on, you know, my kudos to them to be able to pull it off. I'm a consultant. I work odd hours. I have the liberty of working odd hours. I'll send in emails in the evening. Joel would send one back and say, give me a call. And I know he's working. I'd do that. Same thing would happen on a Saturday. You get a reply email. I know they've been putting in a lot of work. But also, given that it's comprehensive, there's a number of good things. Necessarily, there are some details that I would suggest on a couple of my clients' properties that need to just look at a little bit closer. And one relates to the page that I've just handed to you. It came up earlier in one of the questions from Councillor Henry, I believe. And this is 500 King Street North. It's the Manulife property. Excuse me, their head office. Abuts King Street at the expressway. It also backs onto, it's a very large property, it backs onto the residential neighborhood that's in behind. Manulife is happy with the zoning on their other properties and happy with this, save and except for the site-specific regulations that have been applied. And really it's around the low-rise residential lot setback. And the page that I've just handed out shows, in what's noted as Table 1, is the residential low-rise residential lot setback that's applied to all zones. And like many things in this bylaw, it's based on a principle. That principle is the more buildings increase in height, the greater the setback distance. And it's half the height of the building. Pretty easy, even for a planner, to do the arithmetic. On the Manulife property, that setback is different. And at a 6-story building or 20 meters, it's half the height of the building. But after that, the setback requirement is 81 meters for anything over 6 stories. And I can appreciate the thinking maybe that this is probably one of the few, or maybe the only, where it's a high-density zone that permits 81 meters in height that's adjacent to a low-rise residential area. But there are lots of places in the city where the 30-meter, the 40-meter apply. And I would even say that given the 16 stories, the 60-meter height, the 81-meter height, they may not be adjacent, but they could be across the street. They could be greater than, they could be at the 30-meter setback. And so what this does, to me, that principle, I think we need to look at this, that the setback should be the same. There's nothing different about the Manulife property. There's nothing different about the residential neighborhood that's adjacent. So I'd ask through council that you direct staff to have a look at that particular site. The other site specific, we sent another letter in, and again the letters will be a little more eloquent and a little more descriptive than what I'm able to say tonight. But the other one is for Tommy Rackick's property at 6 Dietz Avenue South. There's a site specific applied to it too. Site-specific is relatively detailed. A number of things. This property can only be developed in consolidation with others on Herb Street. There's a hold provision. With no objection, my client is in agreement with the site-specific overall, the details. The one exception is around the landscape buffer that is required. And on this particular property, what's required is a 6-meter landscape buffer that abuts, again, the low-rise residential area adjacent to this particular property. and just for context, the overall zoning regulations require a 3-meter buffer around properties, a 3-meter landscape buffer. And that 3 meters can vary. It's an average of 3 meters so that you can accommodate site-specific anomalies. But overall, the intent is to provide screening and buffer from an adjacent low-rise residential property. My client doesn't really have issue with the fact that it's 6 meters, even though that's double than everything else in the city, but the fact that there isn't an element of flexibility, that in order to adjust that 6-meter buffer requires a minor variance application to the Committee of Adjustment. And that would be unlike anywhere else in the city where that process is through the site plan approval process. And so that's the part we're asking through council that staff would consider changing, that any adjustment to that landscape buffer doesn't require a Committee of Adjustment application. That there's just some element of being able to be flexible, recognizing that this process, any redevelopment on the lands, has to go through site plan approval. So there's some level of comfort in being able to achieve that, as well as lift the hold provision. There's a hold provision applied. The other general comments that we've provided on some of the letters for a variety of clients are similar to some of the other concerns that were raised earlier in the day. General concerns about particularly the tower setback, separation, and tower dimensions, and they affect properties differently. And I think part of the discussion earlier on in this afternoon was the challenge of having a zoning bylaw where necessarily it's a set of regulations that are one size fits all, and the fact that that's difficult to achieve in a variety of different shaped parcels and properties throughout the city. And I don't object or oppose the idea of regulating built form. I understand the desire for that, and I think it's in principle a good thing. But I think I still need some more thought and evaluation that goes into these particular set of regulations, so that they don't have quite the same impact. So it might not be a one size fits all, but a one size that fits most. It's not going to solve every problem. I get that. So one option that would be available to council, I know, like you, I want to see this bylaw approved and in place. There's a lot of good things about it. Resolves a lot of the conversations I have with all kinds of our clients. But one option might be is to simply defer the tower regulations for more discussion, and they could be brought back later. Of course, that'll be up to you and some advice through your staff, but that might be something to consider. So with that, I'll end my comments, and if there are any further questions, be happy to do the best I can.
Thank you very much, Dan. First up, I have Councillor Whaley.
So Dan, Joel and the staff have been taking notes on all the specifics, and I don't want to talk about that. I think because they'll look into it and report back. But with respect to your position of being a former government planner, now a private planner, you might have some unique insights into the conundrum that we face as a council. So it seems to be developer night tonight. All the people who are making presentations are all developers, and what you're telling us is we want bigger buildings, we want less setbacks, we want less tower separation, we want less setbacks above ground and below ground. We hear that. But what we haven't heard tonight, we might not hear tonight, but we've heard from the public a lot in all the different other touch points along the way, is they want smaller buildings. They want more livable spaces. So it's our mission here to try to figure out a balance. So from your perspective, from your long history in both government and the private sector, give us some insights on our conundrum.
Mm-hmm. Through you, Mayor Jaworski. I don't know that I have necessarily any different insight than others. I don't know that my experience lends itself well to knowing more or less than anyone else. There's a lot of knowledgeable people in this industry. But in terms of your question, I think that's what we're seeing also, and as well as on the private sector, and what I know about our clients from our shop is that question of balance. And I think I said this in my comments, certainly don't oppose the concept of regulating built form. Clearly the city has a legal ability to do that. The city should do that. That is a natural progression through when I was here on the public sector, and the higher level, almost sort of gross level of height and density, which was very broad principles. And then we've continued to come down and refine that. And that's where we are now at the zoning bylaw. What we're saying is, as we review these based on our experience, our clients, their land holdings, and we start to look at the impact of those regulations as they are crafted now, there are some things that I think are unintended consequences. And I recognize that what we're trying to achieve is both a intensification and be able to accommodate the forecast growth in the city in certain locations. So there's a need to use our land efficiently. At the same time, it's important that development is both aesthetically pleasing, but also functions in an appropriate way. And these regulations are a step in that direction. The difficulty is from our perspective, we think we're close. When we look at these, and we work in many other municipalities and we're familiar with these type of regulations, we're close, but it's just not quite there yet. And all we're asking for is a little bit more time for staff to continue to consult with the industry so we can work out some of those bigger bumps so that we're not back here in 2 years and a year with a whole slew of zone changes and minor variances, etc. As much as that keeps bringing people to my door and keeps us employed, it's not the best use of our resources either.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, there was a delegate here earlier who was called up earlier in the afternoon, and it was Yang Lu. Is Yang Lu here today? And seeing not, you can come on up, Dave.
It's hard following the tall guys.
Yeah. Luckily it goes down.
Good evening, Mayor and Council, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to the bylaws this evening. And echo thanks to staff. I do have to mention the appreciation that Joel and staff provided to meet with our firm to respond to questions, and I think that was an effective session, and we're thankful that could occur. There's always great opportunity and clarifications that come out of meetings and discussions face to face, so that was appreciated. I had submitted a number of comments on the bylaw, some additional comments today for consideration. I do want to mention that through that process and the process of consultation, we had worked with staff to really resolve on a number of properties and issues, and some of those are further responded to in the staff report. So making sure site-specific provisions for the former brick building were in place, ensuring appropriate transition associated with the Avila lands on Davenport, working with staff as it relates to Creekside Church, and ensuring that facility can continue to grow and expand based on its master plan with the site-specific zoning in place. So we appreciate the efforts of staff in responding to those comments. Also want to recognize that the proposed council resolution related to the future development is a very positive resolution, and an important one for council to adopt. And I thank also Councillor Henry for picking up on that and raising the question with regard to the transition of applications that are currently in process as well. There are lands that we've been working on that are been through the pre-application meeting stage, for example, intensification of Westmount Plaza. And we know that within the next year, we'll be working to making an application or applications as it relates to those lands. So we appreciate that clarification that the intent is to not freeze the city from development, but there will be a process by which applications can be brought forward for processing and consideration. Just another example that's going to possibly be in even a bit more of a limbo is redevelopment of the old post office property at 70 King. That potentially is an example where between this evening and a council adoption or passing of the bylaw, that the application could be in front of council for consideration. So I just want to raise that because that's an application where you'll have heard this bylaw this evening. There'll be an application potentially before council that may not reflect this bylaw, but there will, hopefully be a decision made on that. So that's another example of a transition. In kind of follow up to Ms. Weeby's comments with regard to the zone change application zone, we do support that principle. I think what we would ask though is some further clarification from staff or some further legal input as it relates to the implementation of that zone. Specifically where there's applications that are in, there's applications that are under appeal and before the tribunal. The concern is that the repeal of your entire bylaw also removes the underlying zones, and that the applications that were made were rezoning a property from, say, for example, agricultural to residential, just in general terms. And what this bylaw does is it removes that agricultural zone that was underlined. So there's no actual zone change in process under the old bylaw. So what we would ask that staff consider is the potential to repeal all of the bylaw except for the lands that are identified as zone change application where they determine that that's appropriate. Staff have identified those specific properties. We heard there were about 10 of them, and they're mapped. We just want to be sure that for the sake of our clients and staff and future process, that there's not a process by which another application would be required to this bylaw to make sure that the process moves forward as we believe that staff intend and as we agree with the intention. But we just want to make sure that legally we've covered that off and that we're all on the same page. Just one minor comment that we'll follow up with city staff on is in working through the boardwalk site specific, we've been working with our client on redevelopment of the revisions to that zone. There is a height limit identified for one of the buildings on lands that were brought into the bylaw, and we'll be following up with staff on that, requesting a further look at that. Specifically, at Thorndale and Iron Needles Boulevard, the bylaw would require a 3-story building, and it's not likely the intent based on some of the recent discussions we've had since the crafting of the bylaw that a 3-story building would be built in that location, given some of the considerations associated with visibility being maintained to the medical office building. So we'll follow up directly with staff in that regard to have that discussion. So as I mentioned, had submitted other comments. Some of those other comments reflected comments that were made earlier today with regard to design, so I don't intend to go into those. And those are my comments this evening.
Thank you very much, Dave. Questions of the delegate? Seeing none, thank you. And then questions of staff, Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski. Joel, just on the ZC zone, because I know Council has also received comments from members of the public that, from my read, seem to have a view that zoning them zone change means Council's made a decision about those applications that are before us. And industry is worried that ZC isn't actually the mechanism that staff support it to be, and are looking for some clarity on that. So I was wondering, Joel, if you could take the opportunity to speak a little bit more about the intention behind the zone change zone and how that is intended to function, and staff's view of the comments just made by Mr. Aston in terms of whether it does what we say it will do.
Through your Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Henry, the intention of the zone change category is to recognize existing development applications, zone changes, in some cases official plan amendments and zone changes that are before the city that are in mid-progress. Decisions have not been made as of this point in time relative to the bylaw. And part of our review, when we were looking at those particular properties, we were trying to get some guidance, which there's not much in the Planning Act that directs us in this regard, but how we deal with that when we're adopting new comprehensive zoning bylaws and how we deal with these applications that are in mid-progress. And the approach that we ultimately elected to do with conversation from legal services is to create a zoning category that essentially allows the zoning that exists on the day before the new bylaw comes into effect. So the zoning you have in your property right now would effectively be the zoning that you would have carrying forward. So it doesn't fetter. If you had a 5-meter setback today in this range of uses, that's what you would have if this new bylaw is adopted. It doesn't fetter the zoning framework that's on the property today. And the intention is that the zoning application would continue forward, and council would ultimately make a decision on those applications. But the decision would be based on the new framework and the new zoning bylaw. So where it might have otherwise been a property zoned commercial 8 and now it's U1, council wouldn't be zoning it commercial 8, they'd be zoning it now U1 with whatever the tailored regulations, tailored uses would be within the zoning bylaw. Council, if they adopt this approach, would not be making a decision on the merits of the zone change application or OPA and zone change application before the city.
And just for further clarity from the resident standpoint, is it legally possible for council to apply regulations it may adopt tonight on an application that was submitted before we adopted these regulations? Can you go backwards in time with the regulatory framework that council adopts? Is that something that we're legally able to do from a planning standpoint?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, that's a better question directed at legal counsel. But from a general principle perspective, I would say no, it's not intended to be a retroactive process here. The reality is the zoning of every property in the city is before a council. Council can elect through this process to change the zoning on properties. If a permission was granted in the past by the city or the intermunicipal board, through this process, council can amend the zoning on those lands. Our approach has been to look forward, not to be looking back, carrying forward appropriate site-specific bylaws through to this new bylaw to make sure that projects that are built don't become non-conforming. Again, to allow minor additions, and we've tried to be thoughtful, and you'll see in the addendum report where even the ability to do recognize existing buildings, we've built in some clauses to allow minor additions to those existing buildings to, allow for things, small additions for accessibility or other issues that various buildings want to try and accommodate. Similar to the Carnegie building that the city's looking at. We're trying to add a small addition to make that building more accessible. So we've tried to be thoughtful in the bylaw looking forward, but really the zoning for the city is in front of council and in council's hands.
Thank you. Next up on our delegation list is Chris Pigeon and Steve Amelia. Welcome.
That's great, thanks. Good evening, Mayor Jaworski and members of council. Chris and I are going to pool our time, so I'll start with sort of the general overview, and then Chris will come in and drill down on some of the issues. I did submit a letter on Friday, and I know council has been hit by a whole whack of materials, but I'm hoping you've had a chance to review it, or if not, we'll have a chance after this meeting. So I don't intend to take you through it specifically. I would, though, as I did in the letter, add my voice to the voices that have been commending staff for all the effort that has gone into this. We're here on behalf of the Prica Group, which recognizes that this was a necessary process, and it's been an extensive amount of effort, and to produce a 77-page addendum report over the weekend is quite impressive in and of itself. But one of the things that leads to, from our position, and I take it from the comments I've heard, that there is no intention to pass this bylaw tonight, which is a good thing. We do need more time, and hopefully more time will lead to more consultation. I'm not sure that even September will be long enough. I know there certainly is a desire to get this done. But at a minimum, we need that extra time to try to work out some of the issues that remain. I'm going to step back and quickly introduce who we act for. The Prica Group has been present in the Waterloo region for almost 20 years. I used to sit on this city's Committee of Adjustment, and I remember Mr. Prica coming before us, and Jelko Prica is in attendance tonight. And at the time, they were just getting started in the business, and they really have been an incredible success story. They are now, as far as we calculate, the largest residential developer in Waterloo, with over 40 developed properties containing over 4,000 beds. And during that process, they've employed thousands of individuals and paid millions of dollars, literally, in building permit fees, development charges, parkland contributions. And they continue to manage many of these properties. They are committed to the city of Waterloo only. They don't have projects in Kitchener or outside of the boundaries of city. They focus their efforts on the university community, primarily between the lands between the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier. One of the hallmarks of the Prica Group is they do emphasize design. And that is one of the concerns with that, in terms of what we have listed as the concerns, is that some of the very prescriptive provisions of the zoning bylaw may have unintended impacts on design and affordability, as has come up. Now this process, again, some of this has been covered tonight. We put in the slide that the two underlying bylaws, 1108 and 1418, are almost 50 years old. I do recognize that there are other component bylaws that are even older than that. So this process certainly was overdue and has been a good one. There were drafts of the bylaw released in January of 2016, April of 2017, and July of 2018. The last one just being 12 days ago, and then further amendments today, as far as comments are going. And that again underlines the reason why we do think we need more time. This has been a very useful conversation tonight, but it can't be the end of that discussion. The main issue, if we can summarize it from our client's perspective, is that the bylaw not be crafted in such a way that it limits creativity. There needs to be some flexibility, and there is a danger that if it's too prescriptive, you will create a cookie-cutter approach to development. The majority of development in Waterloo, as been noted, is going to be infill development, and every infill site has different characteristics which should be and ought to be considered on a site-specific basis. And without that degree of flexibility, particularly with the 2-year moratorium that's being discussed, there will be concerns that either it will result in an unintended 2-year freeze or in multiple attempts to amend the bylaw on a going forward basis. I was pleased to hear Mr. Cotter's response in response to questions to Councillor Henry this evening, that the bylaw isn't intended to be carved in stone, and that there will be some flexibility. This isn't a one-off provision. But I do think that concept needs to be thought through carefully because of the moratorium, and how will that play out in practice, so that we make sure we don't get locked in that box. As we've noted on the slide, this bylaw will shape the skyline for decades to come. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Chris Pidgeon to elaborate to some extent on why we have listed the specific concerns that we have.
Your Worship, we'd like to highlight 4 concerns with the zoning bylaw and really kind of try and illustrate the implications of that for council. So the first is a requirement for an amenity area of 3 square meters per bedroom. This building that you see is 228 Albert Street. It was just constructed. And under the old provisions of the zoning bylaw in the green, 211 square meters or 2,200 square feet of amenity area was deemed to comply with the zoning bylaw. Under the new provisions, it almost doubles to almost 400 square meters. The second component then, under the old regs, 10% of that could be in a common amenity area. In the new regs, it's 30%. And you can see that that's a significant increase in the building floor area. Council may ask, what might the implications be? Well, under the Ontario Building Code, minimum bedroom size is 7.5 square meters, so that's 80 square feet. Typically, the Prica Group builds bedrooms larger than 80 square feet. But the implications of this regulation may be that the bedrooms actually move towards that minimum requirement of 7.5 square meters. Amenity areas are already provided for in buildings to meet market demand, so the expectations of tenants is being fulfilled through the amenity areas in all buildings now. If we add a requirement per bedroom, this may work for smaller developments, but some of the larger developments that Prica has constructed may not work. So if you take the example of 750 bedrooms, a development like the Hub, which is located at Columbia and Albert, would require 24,000 square feet of amenity area. So that equates to 5 NBA basketball courts, or approximately 8 times this council chambers area. That is a huge area to program. It is a huge cost. It is a huge cost to maintain. And ultimately, there are only so many amenity types of uses, such as gymnasiums or theaters, that can be programmed within that space. Second requirement then is landscaped open space. Landscaped open space means a portion of a lot predominantly used for the growing of trees, shrubs, grasses, etc. It includes accessory outdoor hardscapes such as surface walkway, patios, or decks, but you can see highlighted in red, it excludes rooftop amenity areas. Well, rooftop amenity areas in Waterloo have become a very significant and attractive amenity space for most multiple residential buildings. We believe that it should be included in the landscaped open space requirement. These are 3 buildings, 222, 228, and 255 Albert and Sunview. These are recently constructed. None of these buildings would meet that requirement of the new zoning bylaw. Tower separation and setback, you've heard a lot about that tonight. I'm going to try and illustrate for you the implications. So previously it was implemented only in the Northdale area. The new zoning bylaw is proposed to implement it citywide. 22-meter tower on the same lot separation and 11-meter interior side yard or setback requirement. Well, this could hinder the creativity that you would see, for example, in the Hub. So this is the Hub project. The building, as it is built today, shows a 3-meter setback to the rear yard, so to the north, and interior to that is a very significant promenade. So really the jewel of the Hub project is this promenade of 18 meters and 12 meter separation. If we were to implement the existing or the proposed new zoning setback, these are the implications. So that promenade would be reduced to as little as 4 meters setback interior to the site. So this is the Hub project as it exists, as it's been built today. And the jewel of this project is really that promenade between the buildings. So finally, I want to highlight an issue with regard to underground parking and grade separation. So this is a cross-section, and a cross-section of the building. So this would be a ramp to underground parking, and then this would be the underground parking. And as we all know in Waterloo, the groundwater table in Waterloo is very high. So no developer wants to build within the groundwater. They all want to be above that. And Prica likes to build about 8 inches above that water table. The implications are, in the new bylaw, the minimum requirement for underground parking is to have 1.2 meters or 4 meters of cover, so soil cover, over a landscaped buffer. That has the effect then of pushing the underground parking deeper, which pushes us into the water table. It's simply unfeasible to do so. We think that 90% of the zoning bylaw is acceptable to Prica Group. We're really talking about 5 or 10% of the bylaw that we would like an opportunity to pause or defer and revisit. We've got some ideas. The 3 square meter per bedroom maybe should be a sliding scale. Maybe it's 3 square meters amenity area for 100 beds, and above that it gets reduced. But we haven't had that opportunity to discuss those issues with staff. We'd like an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I tried as much as I could to be specific with our requests and limited with the requests. So I would agree that the majority of the bylaw our client is supportive of. But we have tried to set out some specific concerns, and the only way to deal with those concerns is to have a bit more time to do so. So that is globally our request. And if I could back up to the main issue, the bylaw shouldn't drive everything else. The concept of affordability and good urban design is still important, and we need to make sure we're striking the appropriate balance with these provisions. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you very much, Steve and Chris. First up, Councillor Henry, then Councillor Henry, then Councillor Whaley.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you both. It's good to see both of you. I just want to make sure I understand, Chris, in terms of the hub project, which I'm very familiar with, certainly. From what I've heard you say tonight, your expectation is that we should craft a bylaw where the hub could be built as designed as of right without coming to council for zone changes or the like on such a large, unusually shaped complex site. Is that what I'm hearing, or have I overstated your position tonight?
Your Worship, Councillor Henry, I think it's an overstatement. What we're looking for is flexibility. We think that the bylaw is too prescriptive, and the hub is simply an example of what we think is an excellent signature building in the city of Waterloo. And it took many years to get to a point of supporting globally, I guess, with city staff, supporting this very significant development. If we were to impose those regulations, this project never would have been built. So if some of those current regulations in the new zoning bylaw were put into a guideline, it would provide that flexibility. And I know that's something that you don't want to hear. You like regulations. We think it's rigidity, and it may create. We've got this 2-year moratorium, which is troubling for all of us, perhaps even for council, to create that opportunity for creativity. But it also creates an environment for the potential for appeals.
And I'll simply say to that, and then I've got a question for staff if nobody else has anything, that this was a site that required an OPA and a zoning bylaw and was comprehensively and master planned and required a fair number of amendments from the existing bylaw and a fair number of significant considerations, and continued to receive committee of adjustment applications to deal with changes in your retailing profile of it thereafter. So I put that there to say that there are processes that have existed and may still continue to exist, notwithstanding the underlying regulation. But I have a question for staff if nobody else has a question, but I'll wait.
Well, you're out of luck because Councillor Whaley and Councillor Veith would like to talk on this too.
So I'll wait.
So, fellows, as a frequent critic of built form in this community, no one's appreciated more the highly stylized architecture that the Prica Group has brought to our city. They've raised the bar for everyone. compete, you have to keep up with that higher standard, and it's really it's been amazing to watch. The idea that we want to create more amenity space and more green space is so that along with this physical beauty, we are able to create a higher quality of life for residents. And I don't see why we wouldn't rely on the Prica Group and others to lead that way to a higher quality of life for our citizens on the inside, just as it is on the outside.
If I could take the first crack at that through you, Your Worship, I think part of the problem I've seen, and I've been relatively new to this process, is that the concept of amenity space combines both private amenity space and public amenity space. So I've seen phrases like building community, and that certainly is the purpose of common public amenity space. Although, as Mr. Pigeon had indicated, I don't think that necessarily needs to be a flatline correlation. That is pooled space, and as the numbers get larger, the size of that pooled requirement ought to be able to diminish. But I think another problem is that the private amenity space, so private balconies, are also included within that. So one way to meet that requirement would be to have smaller indoor spaces and larger private balconies. And in my experience, especially in the areas we're talking about, community doesn't get built on those balconies. Bicycles get stored on those balconies. And that is, I think, something that perhaps needs to be separated. If the community space, the pooled space is important, that can be dealt with separately. But really what will happen is it will drive the concept of having buildings with outdoor balconies similar to the 1960s style buildings, that every unit got their balcony, and the balconies are not overly utilized in most cases. And that is what I was intending to mean when I say that the regulation can drive the design, because that ultimately is one way to satisfy the amenity requirement, and I don't think it necessarily directly goes towards the planning goal.
Yeah, just two other comments. So I'd like council to think about this. So if you look at this project, so this requires close to 25,000 square feet of amenity area under the new provisions of the bylaw. That's in addition to 22,000 square feet of retail space that's provided for on the ground floor. Well, it has a dual purpose. So a coffee shop is a perfect example. Typically has free Wi-Fi. That actually becomes part of the amenity space for this complex. So I think we're trying to strike a balance between amenity area and how do you program that space. I have a second example. So on Hazel, Prica Group owns another property. A gymnasium is a great amenity space. We see that in many of these buildings. But why would you put a gymnasium or program a gymnasium on Hazel Street when the best gymnasium in Waterloo region is right across the street at Wilfrid Laurier University with state-of-the-art equipment? So it's difficult to program the space. The amenity area cuts into the gross floor area at a huge cost. We have other examples for Prica where over 22% of the site area would be required to meet that amenity requirement. You combine that with the landscaped area, it's getting close to 50% of the site area is in combination of amenity and landscaped area. We're asking to revisit. We're not saying no to the amenity area. We're simply saying there probably is a sweet spot where the amount of square footage in amenity area is proper and can be programmed for these types of developments. It's the larger scale developments that the amenity area, as an example, becomes excessive. And we'd like to talk to staff about what the solutions might be. Maybe it's a sliding scale. We move from 3 square meters to 2 or 1 or 0.5 square meters at certain levels above a certain number of bedrooms. We just simply haven't had that opportunity for discussion. You can tell it's a complex issue. Not sure we can get there by September.
Next up, Councillor Reith.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski. Thank you for the presentation. I'm sort of continuing on what Councillor Whaley was asking about the amenity space. I'm just thinking about, you had a slide in there with the 5 NBA basketball courts. and I'm just thinking about if I were living in that building that has 750 bedrooms, that as a resident, that in a building that size, it seems to be a nice amount of amenity space, no matter how it's programmed. So I guess my question is, do you have an idea, this is 30%, right? Is that what we're recommending? Is that what the staff, it's 30%, and right now it's 10%, correct? So what's the optimal number for you to provide amenity space? Because, like I said, I think for a place this big, I think people would appreciate having the space, that much space to program or have amenities in.
Yeah, so your worship, so it's a combination of things. The first is the 3 square meters per bedroom. So it's the 3 square meters per bedroom, and then it's the common amenity area versus private amenity area. Really twofold. So if you look at this graphic, we're really talking about at 750 bedrooms at 25,000 square feet represents 35 square feet per bedroom has to be provided for an additional amenity area over and above the unit. That's a huge,
over and out above the balcony.
No, it can include the balcony, but it is a huge area at $300-400 per square foot in construction costs.
Okay, I see no further questions of the delegations. Thank you. Do have questions of staff from Councillor Henry, Councillor Maven.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd say just in general, without it being too much of a comment on the plan, that the overall goal of the Northdale plan included provisions of amenity spaces as those were felt to be lacking. The fact that we didn't end up with a specific regulation on that seems to be an omission that I appreciate that staff has considered and for council's consideration as part of this bylaw. I think had I known then what I know now, I don't think it would have been missed before council's approval. So I'll leave that there. The concept of large developments, there are other provisions in this bylaw for transition and other things where the larger things get, sometimes some more flexibility on timing and consideration has been thought about. I'm wondering if staff has given consideration to the request of the applicant through its deliberations, and I'm curious if so, what staff's thoughts were on that for large-scale developments.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry, the concept of introducing an amenity area requirement has been in, I think, since the first draft, certainly in the second draft. So there's been, an ongoing conversation around this particular issue for at least a couple of years. The perspective that staff have looked at is, if you own a single detached house, you've got a rear yard, you're provided an amenity space that comes with the property, a porch as well in most cases. Those that live within high-rise buildings, should they be treated differently and not have access to some level of amenity space, whether it's tied to their unit or within the broader building. So the concept kind of drives from there. And ultimately, staff looked at comparable sites around the city. We looked at amenity requirements in other municipalities. As you can indicate on staff's addendum report, a number of that's outlined in, let's see what number it is here. Item 32, provides information on the existing per bedroom estimations of amenity per bedroom requirements provided for a number of developments. So you get a sense of kind of what's out there. And we do in many of the zones today require amenity spaces, much higher than typically require. A commercial 6 zone requires 25 square meters per dwelling unit. So if it was a 3-bedroom unit, it would substantially be a higher requirement. So we've come to the table looking at the proposal to provide some level of amenity space within each particular unit on the basis of trying to build community, create places for people to socialize, to relax. And part of the conversation that we started off early in the first and maybe partly through the second draft is we want to make buildings more livable, not create warehouses, if you will, some of the descriptions that have been advanced through this comprehensive planning conversation. So again, that drove to this objective of creating amenity space within the buildings. It's not uncommon for municipalities to do that. I agree you don't necessarily want to overregulate it, but based on the examples that we've looked at comparing to other municipalities, we did not come to the conclusion that 3 square meters per bedroom was an oversupply. And with respect to a sliding scale, it's a bit of a challenge in that amenity space is driven by people. So the more people within a building, i.e. the more bedrooms, the more demand there will be for amenity space. It's similar to parking. The more people you bring, the more demand for parking. So to create a sliding scale that says once you hit a certain level of development, you can continue to add people to it, but you not necessarily add more amenity space. That's an interesting concept, and it would be a complex, I think, conversation ultimately to have. It's unfortunate that that conversation didn't occur earlier through kind of draft 2, but if council wants us to go back and look at that, we will certainly take that direction.
Next up, Councillor Maven, please.
Thank you. Joel, not necessarily a fair question, but you're the one who's been putting all the time into this. You're the one who's been answering emails up and preparing reports right up till today even. When I came into council tonight, Joel was finishing off his presentation because he hadn't had time to do it before. So you're the one who's been, pressed to the limit as far as time. A few of the delegations have suggested that perhaps a little bit more time might be useful. Do you have any thoughts on that, or you just want to pass on the question? Either is okay with me.
Through Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Maven, certainly through this entire process, we valued all the input that we've received, and we value all the conversations that we have. I think with things like zoning bylaws, we could talk forever and have different perspectives on them, not necessarily agree on precise numbers, and that is the challenge with zoning bylaws. They are black and white. You have to ultimately draw a line in the sand. Is it 4 meters or is it 3 meters? Is it 5 meters? And that's the challenge with zoning. The province, unfortunately, has not allowed municipalities to zone with conditions, which again, if we had that tool within our toolkit, some of these conversations would be much easier around urban design and other provisions because we could get a little more teeth into some of these matters, but we don't have necessarily that legal authority to get into some of the backgrounds. Certainly we have tried to respond, and there's been a long conversation going on to date on the zoning bylaw, 4 years almost now, in the public forum. But certainly we've taken all the feedback that we've received more recently, tried to, where we thought those comments were appropriate, integrate them into this new bylaw. We still have, the earliest we would bring a bylaw back would be September 10th, so that still provides some conversations around these items. And again, we can still have some conversations along the way. But, ultimately, I guess it's council's decision to continue this process, which if it goes much more beyond September, I would suggest it moves on almost into the new year time frame. Or to take the bylaws today. I'm not sure who said it earlier, but these bylaws are not perfect. They will never be. They don't, again, they're principle-based citywide bylaws. They're not intended to deal with site-by-site basis. And we ultimately will see applications being advanced to tailor specific developments to specific sites. But it really comes down to council whether they want us to go back and do further dialogue on some of these issues. And if that's the direction, we would happily do that as staff, or whether council's satisfied with the bylaw to date, knowing that they can always direct staff to continue to work on these zoning issues, continue to try and make them better and try and make the city better. So it really comes down to council's decision and what they want us to do. We were generally asked to bring a bylaw back, mid this year. That's what we've tried to do, and it's been busy this last little while, certainly with lots of input. But again, we're in council's hands to move forward towards packaging something up for September or continuing a dialogue.
Wonderful. Seeing no further questions of staff, we have one last formally registered delegate, Stephen Herzog.
Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. I will touch on a few different issues. I've mentioned some of these before council before and in some of the open houses. I have concerns regarding the height permitted on Regina Street, particularly between Necker and Elgin Street. But along Regina generally, it's a fairly narrow street, and I don't think that's really appropriate for mid-rise as proposed. I think that higher heights are more appropriate along wider streets such as Weber Street or Bridgeport or University, and not really appropriate along Regina. I appreciate the desire to have a step down in height, but we really have to consider the impact on the Regina Street for walkability and the preserving the neighborhood. Looking at the tower separation, I have a concern with the proposed 6 meters, provided the some of the separations are still the same at the proposed 22 meters. I think that if that would be better left out of the bylaw, to leave it at the proposed 22 meter separation, or I'd actually rather see 25 meters. And if in a particular development the site for some reason isn't suitable to that should come before council, so that we can have the democratic process where residents can come and express their opinions on that particular site, and council can make a determination. Because a 6 meter tower setback really isn't a huge setback. With regard to the underground parking setbacks, I believe it's mentioned that for side lots, the underground parking could go right to the lot line, and that concerns me because it could do damage to the root structure of trees that might be on the adjoining properties, and it also implies a risk to the buildings. I know when the buildings were built at near Necker and King Street, the construction was quite close to the Ukrainian church there, and if a developer is allowed to build the parking structure right to the lot line, that presents a greater danger to the adjoining buildings. As for the setback to the street from underground parking, I support the staff recommendation because we do want to have trees where possible, and if there's parking underground, that's going to be very difficult. I realize that underground parking is desirable. I've argued before council before that we should have underground parking rather than surface parking, and but still we have to preserve the ability to have trees in front of buildings. Ms. Wiebe mentioned the separation for commercial buildings, and I actually agree with her that it's less critical in commercial buildings than in residential buildings. However, I am still concerned with the wind effects of wind being channeled between narrow separations between buildings. So we still need to be aware of that risk, but otherwise I think there could be a difference between what we allow for commercial towers and residential towers. With regard to rooftop amenity space, I would suggest that that should be counted as, we could count 50% of the space provided on the rooftop as amenity space. So it's because it's not as valuable as ground level amenity space. So that would let developers do their own calculus and decide whether it makes more sense to provide amenity space on the rooftop versus on the ground. There still could be a maximum as proposed, but I really don't feel that rooftop amenity space is as valuable. And in particular, my concern is how much green amenity space, and I'm not even willing to include hardscaping in that. So those are my primary concerns, and if there are any questions, I'll address them.
Thank you, Mr. Herzog. Questions to the delegate? Seeing none at this time, thank you very much. Did you submit formal remarks to the staff at all, or just these?
Not tonight. Not.
Okay, thank you. And that's all the registered delegations. Is there anyone else here present tonight who wishes to speak to this application? Thomas, come on up. For the record, state your name, in case I don't know it.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'm Tom Hardiker, planner with the IBI Group. I'm here on behalf of 3 property owners in the city of Waterloo. Firstly, I'd like to echo the comments from my colleagues in commending Joel and his planning team in advancing this bylaw to the stage we're at this evening, where it can actually be presented and discussed. First off, I'm here on behalf of the Sunbest Group of companies, owners and developers of a number of properties in the city of Waterloo. And throughout this process, on behalf of Sunbest, we submitted a number of submissions through the various stages of the zoning bylaw. And as of last Friday, we had it narrowed down to 3 properties. And this morning, I received the copy of the addendum report. And I have submitted those comments on to my client, but I have not specifically received any reply yet. But I anticipate that my client will not have issue with item 45 and 50 in the addendum report, because the revisions being proposed by that report more or less align with what's being requested. We do, however, maintain our position with respect to item 46, and that's a property at 364 Willett Street. This property was acquired by Sunvest some time ago, prior to the commencement of the zoning bylaw review more than 4 years ago. And our first submission letter was in the year 2014, specifically on this property. Since the initiation of the zoning bylaw, as you're aware, Willett Street has been significantly upgraded with a new driving surface, storm, water, and sewer services throughout. And as part of that upgrade, the city installed 3 service laterals to 364 Willett Street. Currently, the property is on city water and private septic. The service laterals will allow the property to hook to municipal services. But the zoning that's been applied through this only permits lots, would only permit the creation of 2 lots, not 3 as provided for in the service laterals. Property is proposed to be zoned R3, which requires a frontage of 19.5 meters for internal lot, 22 for a corner lot. Throughout this process, we indicated our preference for the property to be zoned R1 or site-specific to allow for a reduced frontage and area for the internal lots and maintaining the original size for the corner lots. So it wasn't until we received the addendum this morning that this was our first indication that there was any opposition to our request. I have not heard back from our client, and therefore I would like the opportunity to meet with staff to discuss this particular issue, and perhaps we can come to a resolution by the time the bylaw comes back to formal approval or consideration by council. Secondly, I'm here on behalf of make sure I get the correct name, the Roman Catholic Episcopal Corporation of the Diocese of Hamilton, Ontario. I'm here representing the Catholic Church from the 4 parishes in the city of Waterloo. We've submitted numerous letters and emails to the city on behalf of our client. Our client was primarily concerned about the potential for non-conformity, use and non-compliance to the regulations that might be imposed by the proposed bylaw. And as of this morning, the addendum report, which I have forwarded to my client, and once again I've not heard back yet, but the addendum report number 47 and 48 and 49 deals specifically with St. Michael's Church, Our Lady of Lourdes Church, and St. Louis Church on Allen Street. And the addendum report is recommending some minor changes to the site-specific provisions of the zoning bylaw, and from my perspective will address my client's concern, but I'll confirm that in the written submission. My final representation this evening is on behalf of the Muslim Association of Canada and their property at 510 Erbsville Road. We've heard some discussions about the application of the ZC zone on a number of properties throughout the city, and through explanation it's been indicated that that's applied to properties where there's a zone change in process. In the case of 510 Erbsville Road, the bylaw application was approved by City Council to allow for the rezoning of this property from agricultural to institutional and green one space. That bylaw was adopted by Council and subsequently appealed. We appeared on behalf of our client to the Ontario Municipal Board, and the Municipal Board has approved those aspects of the zoning bylaw that would put in place the zoning category and provide for the existing buildings to be used as a spiritual use. The only matter left up to discussion, which would be phase 2 of the board hearing, is whether or not a larger building could be advanced on the provisions of the holding aspect of the zoning bylaw. It's my submission that the ZC zoning that's been applied in this case is not applicable, and that the institutional zoning and open space zoning, which our client has achieved through the Ontario Municipal Board, should be applied to the property. If need be, I have no objection to it being a site-specific zoning, dealing with addressing specifically this existing uses, and that the holdings on hold and subsequent. I understand this is under some discussions at the city level, but we have not seen or heard of how that might be resolved in the upcoming bylaw, and we would like the opportunity to meet with staff and come up to a resolution of how that would come before, as we don't want to lose the zoning that is already achieved by the repeal of the existing bylaws and the amendments. That, Mr. Chairman, is my submissions.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Questions of the delegate? Seeing none, thank you. Good. Councillor Henry.
Joel, can you, on the last matter raised by Mr. Hardacre, can you confirm for me that my understanding is correct? The ZC designation would mean that on the day before council passes a bylaw, whatever is permitted on that property would continue until the ZC is finally resolved. Given the board has already rendered a decision on phase 1 permitting the uses identified by Mr. Hardacre, my understanding would be the ZC covers that the OMB decision on phase 1 is the approved and permitted and allowed zoning on the day before the zoning bylaw would be passed, and therefore people can keep praying in the small house in the garage without anything being fettered, and we wait for the board to finish to before the zone change is resolved. So that's my understanding. Is that staff's understanding?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry, I would agree with your assessment. It is still an active matter that's before the LPAT, so I will not speak to it in detail. But what I will say is that, as Mr. Hardacre indicated, there is active conversations going on at a staff level between planning approvals and legal services, and we intend to meet with IBI Group and the legal counsel for the Muslim associations to make sure that the path forward on this property is the best path forward with respect to the zoning bylaw. So, as it stands today, we didn't make any changes before council as of or through the addendum report, but it is an active conversation, and before September 10th, there may be some movement on this.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wish to speak to this tonight? Please, come on up. You have 5 minutes.
My name's Kay Algie. I wasn't intending to speak tonight. I did write you earlier. But I just wanted to make a few comments about the process. I particularly liked what happened around drafts 1 and 2, where we had a number of public meetings. We had meetings within our ward. Joel came and spoke. We had presentations on it and so on. And I found that really helpful. And I have to say also, I found tonight really helpful. It's been really good for me to hear the developers' objections to it and why they think there should be some things a certain way. I just wish I could say, but here's what I think, you know, about it. Because I find in the whole thing, like my perspective is not one who owns a lot of properties and I don't have clients. I just want the city to be a good city, and I want it to be one that we can live in and an uptown that we can walk around in and feel comfortable in and so on. And I find what's missing for me is why. Why did we make all these changes between draft 2 and 3? Or why are we doing that? And I think, like even tonight, I'm starting to understand some of the reasons for that why. But I think another big thing is, what is community? You know, like when we say we want to build a community, what does that mean? And is there research on what makes a good community in tall buildings? And if there is that being reflected? Maybe it is, but it's kind of like you have to read through the stuff and then guess, this is what we're getting at. So I find it's been an overwhelming process, and I haven't read through it all, and the pace of the addendums has been hard, and so on and so forth. I appreciate what Joel's saying, that we'll never get it perfect. We need to move forward, but I feel it's an extremely important tool. Like for someone like me who's concerned about the big picture, this is how we do it. So I kind of go down on the side, I want really exact rules. I don't want just these guidelines that we can, oh yeah, maybe today, not tomorrow, you know, and so on. But on the other hand, I think they should be thought through. So I don't have a good solution, unfortunately. But there probably are some tools that could help the ordinary citizen make sense of this. Like I thought, if only I could see what this would look like in 3D. If we built up, like just the uptown, which I was focusing on, if I could imagine what that could look like if it's built as to the thing that's zoned, or if there's a bit more explanation. So like I said, they're just comments on the process, and I'm sorry I don't have specific advice, although I'd be happy if you deferred it at least a month, and maybe we can do some of this Q&A, because I would like to understand the other perspectives, and I would like us to work together towards building a city that we want to be in.
Great. Thank you very much, Kay. And thanks for your correspondence and the different correspondence of neighbors and that from the neighborhood that we received over the past 72 hours. Questions for the delegate? Seeing none, thank you. And with that, I'm going to do a last call. Seeing none. If there are no more delegations, this formal public meeting is concluded and the application is now open to council for a motion and debate. Councillor Henry? Nope.
I think this has been...
hold on. Do you want to do that now? Okay, go ahead.
I think this has been circulated to council and have to have a conversation around it. But I propose to move with a comment that IPPW 2018-056, IPPW 2018-058, and IPPW 2018-058.1 be deferred to the September 10th 2018 Committee of the Whole meeting, and further that staff be directed to make any necessary revisions to the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw as a result of feedback heard at the formal public hearing for Council's consideration at the September 10th 2018 Committee of the Whole meeting.
Can I see a seconder for that? Councillor Burke?
So I think in terms of comments then, and I imagine we'll have some comments around here, around this table, some at the high level and then some specifically. I think this has both been a very long process and a very quick process. It is both of those things at multiple different times, and that's because it is big and complex and hairy. And no matter when council were to finally consider a bylaw, there will be submissions and requests and disagreements that will develop reams of paper and good billable hours. I see people getting those, and all of that will happen. And so I would expect that would happen whenever council finally gives consideration to a bylaw. So that shouldn't scare anyone, and it shouldn't be unusual. The question is, have we got enough time to hear the feedback, to implement it, and to get closer and closer, and then get it right enough to do this? And I think the deferral will allow, as Mr. Cotter indicated in his addendum report this morning, the opportunity, particularly for some site-specific conversations, to go far enough to conclude, and also for comments that we've heard and that council's interested in, for staff to review and make sure they can be incorporated. So to that end, I think we've had a couple of conversations here. So I'll have some notes to say on the high level issues that are before us. First, I take Ms. LG's comment that it would help to see what it would look like to heart. I think the last time we did that, broadly as a region, was the visualizing density reports of the early 2000s, when the regional growth management strategy happened, when our heightened density policy happened, and led into the many discussion papers that we had for our official plan 2012. It has been 15 years since the community was engaged in all of that. Many people may not remember that they were engaged in that. Many people are new, and a lot of the landscape has changed. So I take that as a helpful comment around how we can think about helping community understand what's changing in the city, how that change will work, what the different decisions have been, and perhaps as we come forward with an update next year to the Urban Design Manual, there are some opportunities for us to do some of that visualization, and those will be hopefully good touch points to talk about some of the more granular issues rather than some of the bigger planning pictures, and get people a sense of seeing what that is. But on the big disputes of the day, and that's what I'll speak to. The big disputes of the day are amenity area and our specific performance regulations around towers and around sort of landscape buffers and open areas. It's been commented by a few planning consultants tonight that I prefer regulation. Maybe it's because of where I sit on the government side and not from where you sit on the more flexibility is better for my client, because we have a blanker slate. I get that. But at the same time, it's my responsibility up here to, on behalf of the city and the broader community, to help build the city that we want, and the concerns that we've heard from a lot of people through this process and many of the applications over the last several years, is that many buildings feel too massive, they feel too bulky, they're too close together, they block out too much of the sun, they have effects on the street level that we don't like. And having some regulations that staff can point to through the process and require somebody to specifically come forward and say, look, my context is different, here's why, here's a reasoned proposal, go through an amendment process that is public, that the community can engage in and the community can see, is preferable in my view to the current state of the world, which is people come up with an application, we don't really have anything we can point to, and we do our best to apply the guidelines at a site plan level, which is not a public process. So given what we've heard in this chamber, those seem reasonable, and I'm not expecting to see very much happen from staff in the next month to make alterations to those. I think those are the fault lines of the conversation and where they're falling down. In terms of amenity areas, I take staff's point. I was inquiring as to large sites for a reason. But then, since you can have 20% of required amenity area, even up really tall, you've got balconies, there's lots of different ways to design these things. And more people doesn't mean less need. In the event that there are master plan sites, specific proposals of saying, look, we've provided this massive public plaza, it's a different form of doing this, will you consider a reduction in these requirements for us to deal with that? I think that's a conversation that's reasonable to have at a high master plan level, rather than just let people do it and maybe you don't get the trade-off, the positive trade-off and benefit from that. So I think those regulations make a fair amount of sense to me and is preferable. But there are a number of site-specific issues that we've heard, a number of conversations that I think we need more work from staff and applicants to make sure that we've got those pieces right, and I look forward to seeing the result of those conversations in under a month.
Thank you. On my list, I have Maven, Whaley, Burke, Freeman. we'll see, go from there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski. Joel, I've got about 5 questions actually. And I want to start with the approval that is in the agenda. Can you just make sure that I understand completely? It's a tough task I'm giving you, guy. That the approval of 56 is subject to the region's approval of the official plan amendment.
That's correct.
Okay. What's the timing there, roughly?
Through your Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Maven, difficult to tell. The region is challenging these days from a resource perspective to get things out the door, but we have circulated this draft or a very similar draft to the region's planning team for review, and they've identified no concerns. So on that basis, we had requested that if they could move it along once it actually is supported by council through their process fairly efficiently. That was our request to them, and they had indicated positively that they would do their best to do so.
Okay. And is the recommendation then for 58 right below it, is that conditional on that? And does that have to be stated as such?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Maven, the zoning bylaw itself, I believe in section 1, contains a provision that says all the zoning regulations that are enabled as a result of Official Plan Amendment 22 do not take effect until the approval of Official Plan Amendment 22. So there's a cross connection in the bylaw itself to deal with that legal requirement.
Okay, so it's all subject to. Other questions? Councillor Burke referred to the 120-meter notification area, and in the bylaw, it allows now for that 120 to be something else, bigger. Is it reasonable now to put something forward from a staff perspective? I don't know whether the number's 200 or whether it's 400 or whether it's 155, but is it reasonable to do it now while you're doing the bylaw?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Maven, my recommendation to council would be to take that to a separate conversation where staff could provide more detailed information, particularly around notices to council. The official plan amendment that's being advanced gives council the freedom and the choice to do notification in many different ways. It could do notification specific to a development application where they maintain 120 meters, but in certain cases, simply by resolution, that's the way the official plan is set up, say, no, on this one, because of the context, it should be 200 meters or 250 meters. So it could be done on a site-by-site basis. It could be a revamp of looking 120 is not enough, let's just move it to 150 and a hard number. There's versions of it, it should be within one block of this development and use a block pattern instead of a distance requirement. There's many, many different ways, and I think there's a bigger conversation there that would not, we wouldn't do it justice just by putting a recommendation forward, I think, at this point in time through this particular process.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much. The minimum parking standard, one of the things I found frustrating was when the applications came forward, it was always seemed like we're negotiating parking. We have a standard, and yet we were continuously backing off that standard and entering into negotiations, so our standard didn't really mean anything. It seemed to be a starting point. So the minimum standards now for parking, will that eliminate that, what I found to be a frustrating step?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Maven, hopefully it should reduce that conversation. At the end of the day, what it does is it puts the obligation to provide appropriate parking on a property back in the developer's hands more so, right? Because the regulations have been reduced. There still will be instances, though, where developments want to be more aggressive and try and come in at lower numbers. I know the proposed urban office space that's advanced where the ARC site is looking at coming in at a lower number that the base zoning bylaw would provide. So there will be examples where, you know, applications are ultimately advanced to the city to consider adjustments to parking or other parking arrangements. It really is tailored to the development application and the range of uses that are being advanced, but that conversation should certainly be less around the chamber than it has been in the past.
Okay, that's good news. Question for you on the map, Schedule A, and it has to do with the property that adjoins 635 Irv Street West, which is one of the zone change applications. When that application came forward, the area, the land area just south of 635 was zoned SR1. Now I'm seeing it on the map as zoned future determination.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Maven, that's correct. I actually met with the Tweed brothers this morning to chat about that property, and they're reviewing that future determination. I explained to them why that designation was applied, and essentially the property that they own south of the property that fronts Herb Street, the Tweed property is a large property. Some of the design has been determined through the Geese Plan of Subdivision to the east, and to move that property forward, given the grade challenges and other issues with respect to that property, you're going to need at least a zoning amendment and a plan of subdivision, potentially a plan of condominium as well, depending on the nature of what's proposed. So there's lots of planning work to be done. When we looked at that particular property, the challenge was, without more detailed planning information relative to that property, it was difficult for us as staff to draw a line, on the map to say this should be this zone, this area potentially in the property should be something different. So I know there's discussions around, could we put some singles in there, maybe some towns? Should it all be all singles? Should it be some other form? I think the future determination zone category allows that conversation to happen in the chambers with surrounding neighbors' input, and doesn't necessarily fetter how that property might be developed in the longer term, with staff applying a line, kind of a hard line on the property at this point in time.
Okay, so I'm not seeing this as a zone change then? You're changing it from SR1 to agriculture. That's what I thought I heard before.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Maven, the FD zone has been applied predominantly to properties currently zoned agriculture, but not necessarily in all cases. It's really a holding zoning category, if you will. So it basically says you have what you have on the property to date. So on the Tweed property, they have a single detached house and manicured lawn space. That's what they have. That continues forward. They continue to have that use. If they decide to do something more, essentially intensify the property, they need to come forward with a zoning bylaw amendment. And knowing the nature of their particular site, they need at least a plan of subdivision and a zoning bylaw amendment to effectively move that property forward.
So when I went and Mr. Hardiker was there too, and we talked about to the residents in that neighborhood that the zoning that was on the 635, which was 12 years old, at least 12 years old, and had an MR12 on it. I think it's MR12. Mm-hmm. And so that's been there, and that's set in stone. So now the SR1 on this particular case isn't set in stone anymore? That 12 years that we had on the one zone isn't being applied to this one now. That's when I'm think I'm hearing, Joe, right or wrong.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, it can be interpreted that way for sure. We could have taken the SR1 zone, which I think translates to the R1 zone in the new bylaw, and applied an R1 zone category to it. Still would require a plan of subdivision to come forward and lot in accordance with that R1 zone. And if there was alternative land uses proposed, such as townhouses, for example, then a zoning amendment would be required to permit those particular land uses. Again, I met with the Tweed brothers this morning. They're going to go back and review it, and they may make a submission and ask us to reconsider that for September 10th.
Okay,
so,
and again, I'm seeing this as a zone change through the bylaw amendment. And I just don't think that's appropriate.
Fair enough.
Okay, let's see. There was an email, a few emails, and I think that Glenn and Carol sort of straightened me out about a high building wind policy, and that Kitchener's got one and we do not have one. Is that fair? I think, like I said, Glenn and Carol sort of straightened me out. We seem to be okay.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Maven, Glenn and Carol also straighten me out fairly often. So, our official plan ultimately contains some provisions in it that require wind studies for buildings over 6 stories. So it used to be less. It used to be 2 stories. The official plan was updated to essentially, in a more urban context, look at any building over 6 stories requiring a wind study. It's not necessarily done through zoning. Again, we can't apply conditions to zoning to require a development subject to the completion of a wind study. We don't have that legal authority to do that. It's undertaken as part of the site plan process through the urban design guidelines to require any building coming forward that's over 6 stories to have with the site plan application accompanied with it a wind study. And again, it's one of those components that we should look at in terms of making sure our wind requirements are up to appropriate standards in terms of best practices as part of the upcoming urban design review. So that'll be a component that we've already flagged, and there is policy within the official plan that speak to wind studies.
Great. Now on site-specific C32, and I'm almost done, Joel. Just bear with me. You've been hanging in there just great.
Okay.
Okay. Now this is it's zoned RMU 40. So just remind me what that means in terms of height.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, 40 meters would translate typically in a residential project to up to 12 stories in height.
Right. And yet the site-specific restriction says no townhouse. It's just basically townhouses and stacked townhouses. Okay. Now this is a property that's on a corridor. It's on Ontario Road, Herb Street. Collectively, it borders it anyway. Just north of it is another property, and this gets back into the. Is there a zone change going on that maybe I have to be educated on? But the property just north of it talks about an RMU 20 or RMU 40. I have trouble reading the map, to be honest. I can't read that fine print.
If you just bear with me for 1 second, see if I can.
And my apologies to everyone. These are questions that I just wanted to make sure I had the answers to.
My laptop has ended its life for the evening. I know at a staff level we did look at the properties in this general area, and we looked at the existing land uses and the existing site-specific provisions that are applied to the broader area. And ultimately, we did look at, based on kind of that site-specific review, applying an RMU 20 regulation with respect to some of the properties further around on Beechwood Drive. So whereas they previously may have been zoned MR 12 for 12-story buildings, we, through kind of a context review based on the submissions from the public in this area, looked at what the existing land uses were, the likelihood of redevelopment, the site-specific provisions in the area, the district plan policies in the area, and we came to the conclusion that many of the properties were better appropriately zoned RMU 20. It still would allow some level of intensification on those properties, but not to a 12-story building scale.
Right. My question was going to be, why would the property on Herb Street be RMU 20 and the property in north of it be RMU 40? And I think you've answered that question. So I still think it's a zone change, but it's one I'm okay with. The other one I have trouble with. And the very last one, and this is, the word buffer gets thrown an awful lot when we see the presentations. So I looked for it under B in the definitions, and of course it wasn't there. It was under landscape buffer. And the landscape buffer, when I even read the definition, still leaves me a little bit, I'm not clear exactly. Can that definition be refined to, because it doesn't give a base reference point. What it does is say that this is landscape buffer. If you put a property beside Waterloo Park becomes its entire buffer the way I read it. And I'm not sure that was the intent of the definition, or maybe just something to look at, Joel. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Councillor Whaley, Burke, Freeman.
Yeah, so we're going to have another month delay in this process. And because of all the reasons we heard tonight, that makes a little bit of sense. But come September 10th, I'd like to finally move on. We could talk this to death for the next 4 years like we did the last 4 years, but it's time for us to move on. So the development community should be put on notice that until September 10th, Joel's going to continue in his frenzied work to try to include everything else, but we got to move on, and here's the reason why I believe why. In the last few years, the zoning bylaws that we've had in the city have become a bit of a joke. And it's reflected in the fact that every application that came forward had a ream of amendments. A ream. It's like the zoning bylaw didn't even exist. And they would come up with bigger, more density, bonusing density, every imaginable thing. So I'm hopeful that on September 10th, staff put forward a proposal that they believe in, that council will finally endorse, that the community will believe in, so that in future, when we see these reams of amendments, we'll be able to say, enough is enough. We have a community standard here that we collectively believe in, and let's get on with building a great city.
Next up, Councillor Burke.
I'm hoping that month is more than enough time. Do we pay you by the hour? Just questioning. Or is it straight salary? Because that's important for the next month or so. You've done an amazing job, even today, in answering people's concerns really quickly and moving things along, and hopefully that continues for the next month or so. And I'm with Councillor Welly on this, that we've discussed this, well, for the last 3.5 years that I've been here, and at some point you got to move on and put the rules in place, and there's going to be moments where not everybody's going to be happy, but again, I think over the past 3.5 years, there's been a lot of flexibility shown in making decisions. And what really strikes me about it is when I drove into this town 35 years ago, the first thing I smelled was Labatt's. And the second thing I smelled was Seagram's. I don't miss either one of those two, at least not the smell of them. And then to have somebody like Kay come here tonight and talk about her perspective, not from the perspective of somebody who builds the towers or the amenity areas, but just from the perspective of somebody who walks around and enjoys, you know, what the city has to offer and what it looks like. And we need to hear more of that. It's not that the concerns of developers and the people who are building this skyline don't matter, but it's just, believe it or not, like zoning bylaws aren't that sexy for most people. And the fact that Kay would come here and talk about it and what it means to her is really important. So I think that we hear that little bit as well, that people want to enjoy their city and the way it looks and all the amenities that it offers. So if this is the step that gets us toward that, then this is awesome, and let's have at it.
Councillor Freeman.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. Thank you to staff. I know, like, this is a lifetime of work, and it will be your legacy, and I value what you've put into this. I do support the ability to bring this back in September, and I value the time to just think more about what we've heard tonight, in particular around amenity space and tower separations. And one of the pieces that I go back and forth with, and I mentioned this to Mr. Amelia before this session, is that even when we put it in a guideline, someone's going to read it as black and white. And so where do we want the black and white to be? Do we want it to be in the zoning bylaw, or do we want it to be in a guideline? And I think that's what I'm trying to figure out in my mind's eye right now. Because, you know, when we look at one of the OP amendments with regard to the single residential, low density residential, there's a great example where we wrote something and then everyone interpreted that to mean that wherever there was a single residential property, they could come to council, ask for a zone change, and put 6 stacked townhouses just because that's what it said in the OP. And so we've had to provide clarity to say, no, you can't do that. The intent is to retain existing low-rise neighborhoods. And so that gives me pause to say maybe the best place to capture this black and white is indeed in the comprehensive bylaw as opposed to guidelines. And so I need to think more about that, because I have been frustrated over the years with people coming back and harping at me what my OP says because that's the way they chose to interpret it. And basically saying, no, that's not the interpretation in the comprehensive bylaws is perhaps very helpful. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'll look forward to having more conversations with staff. I'd like another meeting for sure, just to unpack what you've heard and help me to understand what I've heard, and to hopefully get this document in some kind of format so that if there's changes to it, they're essentially redlined so that it would be very easy to find. And I guess I have one question for staff, and it's with regard to that other piece of the motion around perhaps crafting a policy of what a zoning application might look like in the interim. And I'm just asking whether or not you feel more comfortable bringing that to council in September, or you'd rather put this piece of work behind us and then do that at a later time. I just didn't know if you saw that as being hand in hand.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Freeman. In an ideal world, I would say we would like to bring it forward because it provides certainty. In reality, we are bringing forward 4 development applications on September 10th. The planning division is extremely busy. Throw that in with all the other work that we're doing, combined with the further update of this. I just practically don't think we would do it justice between now and then. So I'd be happy to work it into our schedule, put it up to the higher priority list, and bring it forward to council as soon as we can.
Councillor Veith.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski. I just want to say thank you to staff. I know how hard you worked on this over the last few years, and for everyone who's come tonight. But I also want to mention that it was a bit distracting for me this weekend reading through or trying to read through all this, because I also spent Friday afternoon in 2 rental units in my ward that, quite frankly, are disgusting. People are living in squalor in my backyard. There's bugs. Places are just not up. People shouldn't be living there. So I had so even being here tonight, it's a bit distracting for me, but that's kind of in the back of my head right now, is that people, like we're talking here about quality of life and space and amenity space. There are people that live in my neighborhood who have, I mean, they're living in squalor. So anyway, I just thought that I had to mention that tonight. And again, looking forward to this being taken care of in September and working on other projects that are meaningful to all the citizens of Waterloo. So, thanks.
And I guess to me, if you reflect back, just and pick a time frame, 10, 20 years, and you think about how much Waterloo has grown. Sometimes old habits die hard. How much Waterloo has grown, and even then, to that point, we've been sprawling in those 10, 15, 20 years. And if you think about just ahead 10 or 20 years, we're going to stop sprawling. It's going to be a life of height and density and getting it right. And I think that this is where we really want to go on September 10th. And I think we'll get there. We can't predict the way LRT will affect us, or parking, how that will impact us. But at least there's a line in the sand for going forward. If you look at it, our newest zoning bylaw is 56 years old. Some date back to World War II. 50 years of 1,000 amendments and the official plan all coming together in one big document. I think what I hear tonight, everyone's a little bit happy and everyone's a little bit unhappy. And maybe that's our lot in life when you're doing that massive amount of change, that everybody's a little bit happy, everybody's a little bit unhappy. And then there's also the rezoning. And the rezoning, to me, it's triggering a community conversation. Sometimes we do need to trigger that. Because as Councillor Burke has mentioned, there's some land that's been zoned for a dozen years that people don't know that what's being built on actually complies with zoning. They've simply forgotten or never knew, or whatever happened to that. So there's like a lot of community conversations that I think are still valid going forward. I'd like to thank all the landowners, developers, and planners who came out here tonight and have been participating in this process, particularly over the past few weeks and over the weekend, and citizens as well for participating over the past 2.5 years, giving input and giving that other side of the story. And of course, I'd like to thank Team Waterloo, Joel, team, and I just can't say enough about everybody coming together to do this massive cleanup. I think this will be a great work of this term of council. Most people probably won't appreciate it, but we know how important it was to the broad vision of our community. And I think, Tim, do you have anything to say about the team or Cam? Like, I think it's just wonderful what the team has done.
Thanks, Mayor, for the opportunity. I will echo the comments that the council members have made throughout the evening. The team has done spectacular work. Thanks to Joel's leadership and Cam's as well. The legal team, all the staff involved. It has been a tremendous amount of work to get to this point in time, and there's still a bit of homework, but I think we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll all look forward to September the 10th.
Great. Thank you. Seeing no final comments, I will call the vote. All those in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you all very much. We still have like 3 minutes of work to do, but we'll get on with it. Thank you all. We are down to the short strokes. There's some, I don't even have my agenda anymore, but there's some communication from the region or somebody like that for your perusal, and we'll move on to new business. I know Councillor Henry had something.
Yes, Mayor, I appreciate the opportunity. I had given Mr. Turner a heads up the day before the bike lanes, separated bike lanes in Uptown had opened, that I would be asking this question in August so that he could have the data to respond to my question. I know he appreciates that. So I was asking, I wanted to know from Mr. Turner, how many times since July 9th have municipal enforcement staff proactively patrolled the protected cycling lanes, and how many tickets have been issued for parking in those cycling lanes in this time?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry. The bike lanes have now been officially open for 5 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, we had dedicated enforcement, meaning an officer on King Street for the entire day for 2 weeks. The number of patrols during that loop, the officer was doing a loop up and down, would be 20 to 25 a day. In the final 3 weeks, we've blended, we don't have an officer dedicated to King Street, but we've blended the patrols, more frequent patrols, into our Uptown area parking enforcement route. At last count, we were at approximately 80 to 90 patrols in that 3-week period. As of today, we've issued approximately 50 tickets, and there's been many opportunities for staff to educate drivers. So if the vehicle was occupied, as we typically do with any offense, we ask them to move or they get a ticket. The majority of our activity was also in the first couple of weeks. We've seen not the enforcement activity, but the actual violations decrease as time goes on. At this point, we continue to monitor it, and we'll continue to monitor as a frequent patrol of the larger Uptown zone that we enforce. Feedback from staff would suggest that the message is starting to sink in. There's still more work to be done, but a combination of enforcement as well as a lot of the media attention that the lanes have received over the last 5 weeks would suggest that it's starting to become somewhat normalized.
I appreciate that, Mr. Turner. I mean, I appreciate the direction. I think it would be worth continuing to be very active in this area and to monitor it. I'd be interested a month from now at the September Council meeting to see if the trend has continued to decline in violations or if it's leveled out and we need to take more active enforcement, because just a few violations are enough to disrupt a whole lot of people's attempt at doing exactly what we're looking to do.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry, if I could, perhaps a little longer monitoring, just given the fact that what the city tends to see with thousands of new residents coming to the city as of Labor Day weekend, perhaps a little longer monitoring period to the end of September might give a better picture?
Recognize we've got some constraints on scheduling in terms of number of meetings, and there's something happening in October. I can't quite remember what. But if we've got a meeting in October and you want to go to the end of September, I'd be happy to hear in that meeting in October we might still have rather than the end of September.
Okay.
Any other business? Seeing none, we have some bylaws to enact. Anybody want to move those? Councillor Freeman does. Councillor Veith does. All those in favor? Motion to adjourn. Councillor Whaley, Councillor Veith, all those in favor. It's all of us. Thank you.